this time I'm going to do what I've done in the past and just be here for about an hour talking about just about anything anyone else wants to talk about, actually, with regards to integrated pest management or plants or their physiology or their transcriptome or maybe an insects or pests like proclivities or beneficial organisms proclivities. Really, I'm just here to do a question and answer video, really, for anyone who might have questions or want to check the variance on different answers they might have gotten in the past for certain things. For example, one topic of conversation that I think is often brought up, or at least for me is often brought up, is powdery mildew. So, powdery mildew on cannabis and powdery mildew on various other plants. So there's this really interesting research report that I posted about a little while ago, within a month's time, I think. And it was really cool because this group of researchers, they were looking at Quercus, which is oak, Quercus genus, and they were looking at how it was able to be like a reservoir for the earliest powdery mildews. And they were looking at how powdery mildew genetics over time sort of indicates that the oak tree species might have been a very important, or at least the family in general that the oak is part of, was incredibly integral to the evolution of powdery mildews. Obviously, they didn't spring out of nowhere, and there were fungi that are ancestral to powdery mildews, right? And we're dealing with the progeny and the evolution of that. But the reason for this is because Quercus is pretty much the only genus that has so many different powdery mildew susceptibilities. A lot of powdery mildews are narrowly specialist. However, some of them are quite a bit more generalist. And some people believe, wrongly, that powdery mildew, the only powdery mildew that infects cannabis is one kind. And then they never say what species it is, at least in my experience. So, I recently did a video on this called Golovinomyces sicariceum, and that's one species of powdery mildew that infests cannabis, but it also infests cucurbits, so things like cucumbers and squash, right? It also infests, if I remember correctly, tomato. But my point being is that you can end up in a situation where one kind of plant gets Golovinomyces, and then that plant then goes on to vector it to your crop plant, in this case cannabis, for example. So it's incredibly possible for plants that are not treated like crop plants, or plants that are not treated with any sort of antifungal agent or whatever your management program is for powdery mildew, it's possible that other plants on a property or nearby a property, maybe outside of your own property bounds, frustratingly, can vector the mildew to your plants. And, it's kind of frustrating because, obviously, even if you do everything right, if you're, for example, in an outdoor setting, you end up having this problem in which your pests and disease pathogens will be coming in from another person who might not be doing things correctly, or a group of people, rather. So you really need to sort of, if you can, if it's possible, it's very beneficial to establish a relationship with the people that grow plants around you, if you're in such a situation where that's possible. In a residential area that's possible, right? But even in a commercial setting, it's sometimes possible. At least in my experience, a lot of people who grow plants in greenhouses and such, or in like ornamental horticulture, they all kind of know each other. sort of. Not everyone knows everyone. But in my experience, at least, especially people who are local, if they're big enough, they tend to know who their like competition is at least, or they happen to know who their colleagues are, if you want to call them that instead. And in some cases, it's more like we're all kind of in this together, or at least that's kind of the feeling I've often gotten from people. It's not always the case, and of course, at the end of the day, you are competing with people who are in the same niche as you. But if you can establish nice situations and nice communities, then you might be able to, as a whole, not deal with pests and pathogens. Because honestly, it works out better for you if somebody else is not dealing with a pathogen or a pest, and then having that get out of hand, and then that infecting everyone else, and then reinfecting you, because you might get good, but then they don't get good, and then that comes back to you. It's the same sort of like immunology problems that we see with like people who contract illnesses, right? Even if it's something as simple as like the flu, right? Somebody gets the flu, or somebody gets some infection and then passes it to somebody else, and then maybe it mutates or something in that person, and then somebody else who just got sick from the other person is now still susceptible because it's changed or something like that. Happens with plants too. But for those people who are joining now, well, all 4 of you, as Instagram is telling me, I'm here not to talk about Quercus or powdery mildew, but I'm here to talk to you about questions that you might have. And I just want to hold this space out for people who are interested in that, because that's just what the plan is today. So I'm going to just keep talking until somebody asks me a question. So that's your challenge. So let's see, what else to talk about? Well, I did talk about powdery mildew. Powdery mildews are the Erysipelas family. People who have seen me comment online have probably seen me use that phrase. Coast Now says that they dug my IPM talk the other day, and I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but I appreciate that nonetheless. Captain Pax, appreciate it. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to keep on going. So Erysipelas are the family of powdery mildews, and like I established before, they are known in a whole bunch of different plant families, and sometimes they are more specialized than others. Then there's the downy mildews, which are a totally different group of organisms altogether. They're actually what you would call Oomycota. Oomycota are kind of a fusion between fungi and animals, actually. They're not actually a fusion. I'm just using that as a sort of a metaphor. What I mean to say is that they produce spores that have little flagella, and those flagella allow it to sort of move in water, for example. A lot of downy mildews, a lot of like Pythium, for example, is like this. So what you end up having a problem with is that the organism will traverse through the water. So if you have like a water splash, or if one plant's infected and you like pour water on it, or you irrigate it in some way, what can happen is that the spores can be transferred through the liquid medium, but they can also move as well somewhat. Obviously they can't like fly or anything like that, but you end up with that problem where in which the organism will move through the soil to your roots, and then other plants in the nearby vicinity. So like most plants aren't in nature planted with a banker, box. They're on the ground, so their infection likelihood is much greater than like if you have each plant in its individual pot. Although if it's in the irrigation system, you can get multitude of infections at the same time. So that's downy mildews and powdery mildews, and I guess I could talk about viruses. Viruses are a thing that a lot of people don't often ask me about, because like 90% of the people who follow me grow cannabis, which is no problem. But in agriculture, there are a ton of viruses. And I only make that point because in cannabis, there are also viruses that infect cannabis, but the research is much more lacking for obvious reasons. But we do know that there are some. In other plants, though, there are tons. There are tons of other viruses, and they're vectored by insects, or they are not vectored by insects at all. They are, in fact, vectored by, like people. People could touch the infected plant and then transfer it to another plant. This is very common in, like, tobacco mosaic virus. That's why they say that, like, people shouldn't handle tobacco products and then also handle organisms that can be infected by the tobacco mosaic virus, because the virus is still possibly active even in that tobacco material, which is pretty impressive, to be honest. That's a really incredible feat, if you ask me. But some viruses are going to be really, really noxious to a cultivator because they can do things like make all of the ripe fruit unripe. They can do things like gnarling the plants. They can pretty much make sure that an entire crop is useless, or yields are like 90% less or something like that. So they're very much a travesty. But at the same time, we've been finding that we can use viruses or their genome as an inspiration for other interesting green technologies. Studying how they infect allows us to understand what about the plant physiology is being exploited, and then how you can reduce that. So, for example, like in a computer. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the virus. So El Totago says, crazy for a virus to be able to survive in smoke. It's not the smoke necessarily, it's just the product. Like somebody might take like dipping, or like chewing tobacco, chewing tobacco, and then like touch the plant. That's usually how it happens, or in cigarette tobacco or something like that. That's how that happens. Where was I going with that? But you do run into a problem with viruses because they are so destructive, but you can utilize an analysis of how they infect, and then you can understand how they exploit the plant. Very similar to how you would, for example, go about fixing an exploitation in a computer software program. So if you had somebody who was like hacking your software or whatever, they might know a specific exploit, a specific code of data or something that allows them access to the software, or allows them to maybe redirect some information, or allows them to read information that they shouldn't normally be able to read, or something like that. In a very similar way, plants are just, or all biological organisms are kind of like large biological computers, and our genome is like our code. So if you understand that in some plants there are mutants that lack certain code, that the virus needs to exploit that code in order to be effective at infection. If you take out those genes, you don't have to add any genes necessarily. Sometimes you can just remove them, and then you no longer have a purchase for the virus to like grab onto. And I'm being metaphorical here, but I think that makes sense. El Totago says, yeah, makes more sense for it to be, in the plant matter. Yeah, if it was able to, like, survive being, like pyrolyzed, I mean, that would be really impressive. That would be incredible. I would probably name it, like, one of the best organisms in the world. Better than the tardigrade, the water bear, for being able to survive extreme conditions. That would definitely go to a virus that could do that. That could just withstand incineration. But some viruses, so like, there's been a ton of research on viruses. But I'm getting a question, so I'm going to shut up. Captain Pax asks, or says, we grow a lot of mint, and I believe some of our plants have a virus. Some have yellow or brown spots and don't grow correctly. Good info, looking into it more now. Okay, so maybe you have a virus. It's possible, but it might also be possible that you just have a little bit of like a microbe, viruses are microbes, but you might have like a fungal or bacterial problem too. A lot of people aren't aware of these, or I mean, a lot of people are, but many people don't talk about them, so some people are not aware of them, which is just convoluted. So what I mean to say is that there are these things called Koch's postulates. There's a guy named Koch. Some people call him Koch, but that's not how you pronounce the name. It's German. It's Koch, Koch. If I'm remembering correctly. There should be, it's Koch, Koch. Yeah. So, Koch's postulates are a methodology by which you can verify whether something is what you suspect that it is as a microbe, as an infectious agent. Because humans typically can't just look at a plant and take a look at the symptoms. Some symptoms are unique and diagnosable, and they're distinctive, and they're what are called diagnostic. But other plant symptoms are not. They're diagnostic agnostic, or they're generalized, or they're not symptomatic, or they're asymptomatic when they have no symptoms. So the problem that you end up with is that you've got multiple different infections that can look very similar, but you don't know exactly what the species is. Small sample of some of the many Pythium species out there, like Aphanidermatum, Aristosporum, Arhenomanes, Buismaniae, Camerandrum, Debarianum, Deliniense, Disotocum, Aminiosum, Graminicola, Heterothalicum, Hypogenum, Insidiosum, Irregulare, Iwayame, Massiphorum, Middletonii, Myriotylum, and others. Or you know what the genus is, but it's really a complex of different species, and maybe you have not just one infection, but you might have multiple infections. You might have a primary infection that's causing most of the damage that you're seeing, and a secondary opportunistic infection that's happening because it's already damaged, the plant that is. And you can run into that problem too. Certainly with viruses, for most of human history, that's been a very difficult thing to kind of do, and obviously as people are wont to do, they will blame things like demons and spirits and bad luck and scorn and witches and things like that, because we didn't really understand how it all worked, but now we do. Now we understand that witches and magicians were really just people who could manipulate viruses. What they really were druids. I'm just joking. Captain Pack says that we spray fungicides frequently, so I want to say it's not a fungus. Could be bacteria. I believe it's caused by an infection from aphids. Okay, that's interesting. If you're spraying a lot of fungicidal agents, it's possibly not that. But like different modes of action for different fungicides might be more or less effective versus other fungi. So it can be a little bit difficult to tell. But yeah, if you're preventatively treating for what would normally infect your mint, then that's probably a safe bet, right? So besides Koch's postulates, you've also got like Occam's razor. And for anyone who's not aware of Occam's razor, it's a sort of a logical axiom. So essentially, the simplified version is the simplest answer is usually the correct one. A less simplified version of that is the answer that you have to make the least amount of assumptions to come to the conclusion of is more likely to be correct, which I think is my favorite way to put it, because people will oversimplify the word simple, and they think, oh, it's the one with the less words, or it's the one that like I can say the easiest, but that's just fallacious. What I really mean is that, or what the razor really states is that if you believe there's a problem, how do you come to a conclusion without like too much, without knowing everything that's possible, because nobody knows everything that's going on. But if you have to make less presumptions about one conclusion than the other, it's more likely to be that one, because you don't have to consider that one as mysterious, and you don't have to worry about all the other different contingencies that go along with it. And when it comes to deducing whether or not a plant pathogen has infected a plant, or even whether or not, if you know there's a pathogen, or you strongly suspect there's a pathogen, what pathogen it is, sometimes you can't deduce it without laboratory analysis, which is sort of an unsatisfactory answer. I get a lot of questions from people, a lot of pictures where people are like, what is this? What's going on with this? Do you know what this is? And if it's like browning or yellowing, I really can't tell always. I don't have the context to be able to tell necessarily. A lot of biotic pathogen symptoms look like abiotic pathogen symptoms. Or not pathogen symptoms, rather. A lot of biotic pathogen symptoms look like abiotic problems. So, like, it could be that your yellowing is caused by a pathogen that's choking the life out of your plant, like Fusarium wilt. Or it could be like the sun. Maybe you got sun scalded, or maybe the sun's too hot, or the lights are too hot, or maybe, or too close rather. Or maybe the plant's drying out and desiccating, or maybe something about the amount of light it's getting is messing with its concept of what season it would be. Not that it really has a concept, but you know what I'm trying to articulate. Maybe it thinks that it's time to flower when you really don't want it to, because it's not where it should be in its developmental cycle, for example. What do you prefer for prevention of botrytis, if not trichoderma and genetics? So for botrytis cinerea, the gray mold, I would have to say that for treatment, it's very difficult. If you happen to get it when you're not in flower, with cannabis, for example, then one thing that you can utilize is sulfur powder, micronized sulfur. That's what some people utilize. And it's useful because sulfur is an incredibly fungicidal agent. Although one of the problems with using sulfur is that it's also an insecticidal and a mitocidal agent. So if you've got bad insects, mites, and fungi, then you've got the trifecta, and you can use the sulfur for all of them in one fell swoop. But at the same time, if you're using biocontrol agents that are mites or insects, then the sulfur will also negatively impact those organisms. So in an integrated pest management system, you need to consider all of the different factors and everything that's working together in harmony. And you want to make a holistic sort of answer to your problems. But that doesn't necessarily answer your question, because you were asking like for prevention, and that's more of a treatment, more of a curative treatment. So I would say that, like a lot of pathogens, the best defense is avoidance and exclusion, which are cultural controls and environmental controls. So controls that have to do with the disallowing of the pathogen to come into your grow space. If you're growing outdoors, however, that's a tall order and not necessarily possible. If you're growing indoors, it is a little bit more possible and a little bit more feasible. As far as products are concerned, there are biological microbes that are sold as a preventative, and I've seen the data on them. Like, for instance, for some trichoderma products, like you're asking about, but I know a lot of people who pay a lot of money for microbial bioinsecticide or biofungicides rather, and bioinsecticides, and they don't actually see the benefit from them. And, you know, I'm not always with them 24/7, so I don't necessarily know what's going on. It could be that they're not applying it correctly, and they don't realize that because they're not the ones applying it. It could be because the botrytis was particularly virulent. It could be because it established in a place where the spray didn't get a lot of coverage on, and then maybe they didn't apply it enough after that. There's a multitude of possibilities. And I would say it's very important that people don't necessarily utilize a product have it work incorrectly one time, and then come to the conclusion, oh, well, this doesn't work, this is snake oil. Because that's not necessarily true. And sometimes it's as easy as, oh, I didn't know that I can't apply this and that at the same time. Sometimes it's a much more esoteric reason. And I've certainly been in the situation where I've applied something or I've utilized something and it didn't work out, but it works out for other people, and I have to take that into consideration. I don't think that there's some conspiracy where those people are just like saying it works because they're getting kickbacks or something. It's more likely that I'm doing something wrong, or that I misunderstood some part of the procedure, or possibly it's just really difficult to control in a certain geographic area. And a lot of the problems that the worst answers that I can give to somebody is, I don't know, or even more frustrating, there's nothing you can do about it, possibly. Because of your geographic range, it's possible, like in some places, for example, I have an anecdote about this. And I guess I'm just going to ramble here at this point. Hopefully I've answered that question. But, so there's a ornamental grower that I've worked with in the past, and they had a problem in which they were applying a fungicide for powdery mildew. And they were applying this fungicide. It's not like a biofungicide. It was a chemical, synthetic chemistry fungicide. I want to say it was something like no, I don't remember off the top of my head. But anyways, they were applying this fungicide, and it wasn't working. And they were applying it right on, and it just was not working. So the fear was that they had a resistant population in their greenhouse. And that would have been very, very terrible. Very terrible to discover for the people making the product, and a very terrible discovery for the people who were trying to get rid of this powdery mildew. It ended up being that that was not the case. The problem was that the person who was applying the fungicide wasn't getting enough coverage. And they were very defensive about that aspect of it, because part of the company culture was that if you made a mistake, you were lambasted quite a bit. And this is where the story goes from being an anecdote about the application of a treatment to why you should treat your employees well. Because if there wasn't such a culture of fear for the employer, or for the employee rather, then they might have come up and honestly said, hey, maybe I'm not spraying well, or maybe could it be me? Because as soon as they admit that possibility, they become a target for ridicule, and they become a target for termination, or being called out, or some sort of a reprimand. All of those factors were probably going through their head. So anytime somebody thought that they were doing something possibly wrong, they were totally tight-lipped about it. Which makes my job difficult, because if you're trying to find out what the problem is, and you're not going to hurt someone's employment over it, you're just trying to find out, trying to inspect what the problem actually is, and it could be multiple factors. If somebody lies like that, it makes it much more difficult to find that out. And if you start with the assumption that everyone's doing everything correctly, then you might miss what is actually a really important factor. Like, maybe somebody didn't spray as well as they could, or maybe somebody sprayed in the wrong area, and that was the confusion. Who knows? If you're coming out from as an extrinsic force looking in, there's a ton of context that you're lacking. And if you're embedded in a group for quite a bit of time, you gain a lot of that context. But you would never gain that context if you didn't embed yourself into that group for a period of time. So it's hard to say what's wrong in a lot of places without a ton of context. And it's also hard to tell what the problem is without that sort of context too. if I didn't know that somebody was spraying a fungicide and they had a problem that looked like a fungal disease, possibly, or some fungal diseases, then I might come to that conclusion if I didn't already have that context. For those people who are joining, I'm basically holding this space for people who want to ask questions. That seems to be the most popular thing that people want to do on the live feed. So I just wanted to, since I had some time, be here for answering some questions that people may or may not have with regards to IPM and other sorts of things related to plant cultivation. Certainly, I'm not opposed to other questions and comments and things like that, but that's mainly what I'm holding this space for. General Mombi asks, what specific strains of trichoderma are the most beneficial in combating fungal infection? Oh, I mean, like, I guess that's not really... Harzianum is the popular one, right? So, I mean, I assume you mean isolates and strains and, like, what exactly... So, like, there's a ton, there's, like, thousands that exist. And commercially, there's like there's quite a bit of multitude, and it depends on where you live and what are accessible to you, and all of that sort of regulatory import that sort of modulates how one would answer this question. But I would say that I don't actually know what the most beneficial are because it's context dependent, I suppose you could say. You do make a good point about Trichoderma harazineum, but I think that doesn't... I mean, fungal infection is not, like, all-encompassing. It's, you know, it's not just... You should check the label for the microbes, or for the antimicrobial or antifungal biopesticides. Because they don't go after every fungus imaginable. They have specific fungi that they go after. So that's an important qualifier for that. So I don't really know. It depends on the fungus you're trying to treat. And I think it also depends on the crop, because certain crops do or don't get certain infections. Laughing Shaman asks, do you have a preference between conventional or organic farming methods? Like, do I prefer organic farming over conventional farming? Is that the question? And Tatago says, yeah, once a plant is susceptible, a bunch of different things will hop on. Yeah, that's true too. What's up, Matthew? What's up, you, OGK1911? Laughing Shaman qualifies with over synthetic salts and chemicals. Oh, I mean, like, okay, so that's what you mean. Because I wouldn't have gotten that from that question, because just because, conventional means different things to different people, and don't I know it, organic means different things to different people, so I always have to ask for more detail, because... if I assume that someone means organic based on, like, the EPA or the FDA, like, designation of organic, the OMRI or whatever, that's way different than, for example, somebody who thinks that, like, OMRI is foolish and it doesn't go far enough, or some people think it goes too far, and everyone has sort of a different opinion on that. Usually there's a big split between, like, producers and consumers with regards to what's actually organic and what's not. But I mean, I definitely prefer... What I prefer is the system that has the smallest footprint for the local environment, for detriment, but that also produces the best quality of product. And you can't necessarily do that. I feel like a hybrid system is important. And with technology, so, like, that's a good question, because I think it really, how do I put this? it really segues into a great conversation about different places and their regulations, and also what's normal for different countries, different geographical zones, for the development of certain plants and cultivation of certain plants. And yeah. So for people somebody's calling me out for having this assault gun. This is a little gun that spring shots salt to kill flies and other sorts of things like that. Laughing Shaman says, I figured you would say hybrid because you were concerned with results more than philosophy, which yields profits over quality, which I agree with. Okay. I mean, like... I would say that, like, a big important part of that is that, like, in another video that I made, I mentioned that IPM can't, or rather, all agriculture is detrimental to the local environment, the local ecology, and the problem with that is that it really comes down to mitigation of that footprint. So if you are in a field, you have to clear the field. If you're in a forest, you have to clear the forest. You can't not clear the forest and expect a certain yield. It's just not realistic. And if you're like in the ancient days, then your options were limited, and you might not have even considered the fact that you might be harming the local environment or anything like that, because that sort of knowledge and information didn't really exist, not in like the way that we understand it now. He's saying, some people instantly shut down conventional ideas if they aren't up to their definition of organic or natural, so does regenerative farming not exist? Oh, okay, that's a good question. So, well, let me segue to what I was going to say before. For example, in like Holland, it's a very small country compared to like the United States of America, where I reside. And even considering California, the state, the province where I reside, and they are super duper horticulturally invested, and it shows in their government spending, it shows in their professionalism, it shows in the sorts of products that they make. And I'm a little bit biased, but I bring it up because not only are there different regulations and different normalcy, you also run into a better grasp of the new technologies that are coming out that allow somebody to be conventional and have less of a ecological footprint in certain aspects, not all aspects, but certain aspects. And of course, when you break it all down, there's the product that you're making and on site and all that. But if you have to bus in a bunch of workers, or if a lot of your workers get injured, or if they're exposed to a lot of pesticides in the future or at the current time, and then they develop some exotic cancer 30 years down the road, it's hard to say what the footprint is actually going to be until like all the consequences happen, and sometimes the consequences are still far-reaching, and even now. Obviously, agriculture it happened at one point or multiple points in history around the globe, and then continues on to this day. So the consequences of agriculture and the agricultural revolution are still happening now. But I bring up Holland for that reason, because different places have different priorities on what's okay and what's not. In America, there are a lot more people on like different scales of like, I guess you could say, like establishment and like in technology. So like people could have greenhouses that are sort of low tech, and they can still manage to be more or less economical and as a business be successful. However, in Holland, you don't see a whole lot of like low-grade, low-tech greenhouses. You have like high-tech, high-fidelity, high technological prowess. You've got a lot of really interesting systems, new methodologies, new research on pathogens and pests and things like that. At least that's been my experience, not working in Holland, but working with people who are from Holland and work in Holland and the Netherlands and places like that all the time. So, to answer your question, conventional, I think, is sort of like what it means is always changing, and what organic also means is always changing, because those same people who are conventional are also using a lot of really important, are making a lot of really important changes. Some of those changes are things like having their substrates and their other products be biodegradable, and in that way people can reduce their footprint on the environment. That's a huge thing. But they're still doing things like constructing greenhouses. I mean, the land is already cleared, but it was cleared and it wasn't clear at some point in history, so that land is still being replaced. As far as your question about regenerative farming not existing, I'm not a regenerative farmer, but my understanding is that regenerative farming as a concept is totally and similar to what I'm saying already in practice. It's more on a gradient, so where you reside on that gradient depends a lot on what your resources are and where you are and what you can do and what you're growing and that sort of a thing. Certainly, like, if you take my point about how all agriculture damages the local environment to an extreme, then you could say that, like, in no way does agriculture ever come about as regenerative, because you don't have that replacement of the original biota or the original ecosystem or any of that sort of stuff. But I think that that's sort of missing the point, because my point is not that you can't grow plants and cultivate food and other luxury items like spices and things like that, and like because you have to like clear land that suddenly you're this terrible person. I don't think that, and I don't believe that, and that's not what I mean. And I appreciate that you think those are great answers. Thank you. But what I do think is important to consider is that you know, it is mitigation. It's not perfect and it's not 100%, and you can't possibly have that because the Earth is finite, right? And so the population is continuing to grow, and it's really important for us to be as regenerative as possible, but it doesn't mean that we're like going to go back to subsistence farming necessarily. It doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily like grow within like jungles or anything like that. I'm not saying that doing those sorts of things in some capacities aren't bad. It's just that there are a lot of logistical reasons for why that is, and it's not necessarily like just unrespectable. You know what I mean? I struggle to find solace in the morality of any one single agricultural method. There isn't a 100% regenerative method I have seen. Right, because for it to be 100% regenerative, in my opinion, I feel like that would require things to go all the way back to how they were. And how far back are you going to go? Are you going to go as far back as before the first humans cultivated that land and developed it? Do you know what it even was like? People don't have like genetic records. They don't have they don't have field data that like shows you like, oh, we had this many native bees and we had this many diptera and we had this many coleoptera and we had this many hemiptera. They don't have that information, so there's no way to know, for one. And for the other, environments are constantly changing too. That's not an argument for just being like, who cares, things change, like whatever. We shouldn't be flippant about it, but at the same time, we should also be respectful that things are changing and they are always changing. And people like to throw around the phrase stewardship. I threw around the word stewardship recently, and I think that's it's an accurate term. because we're sapient creatures that are able to think about that sort of a thing. Whereas another animal or microbe or something isn't going to be thinking about that sort of a thing. Like, pests and pathogens, they don't, so there's this terminology called extirpation. Extirpation is localized extinction. So all that means is that in a localized area, a certain organism ceases to exist. It may also exist in other places too, and it might repopulate the area. But for this local area, there's an extinction event about a certain species or multiple species or something like that. And the reason why that happens is because you don't have powdery mildew going onto these plants and thinking to itself, maybe I shouldn't kill this one. Maybe I should farm this for a long time. Because they're not thinking about it. You don't have leaf beetles going in and eating the leaves of all these plants and then going, I'll eat this plant, we'll all eat this plant, and we'll lay our eggs on this one, and we'll make sure not to damage the seeds so that it can grow again. They're not thinking about that. They're just eating as much as possible, and if they just happen to not be destructive enough to kill all of the plants in the local area, then their progeny will have food. Obviously, you have other predators that come in and balance that out, and it's this very complex weave, this web that they weave together of the trophic levels and gradients and things like that. Stewards of the land, stewards of the plant. I'll smoke to that. Well, you smoke to that. I think that's a very great sentiment to prosit, to cheer to. It's it's something that we all have to consider, and it's hard. I also don't think it's very useful to shame people also, because they don't necessarily have control or very much control over how they eat or where they eat or where they get it. I do know that certainly people who eat vegetables more than meat, or they don't eat any meat or something like that, they can, vegetation tends to cost a lot less than meat products, but not always. And it's not always filling. Some people have different dietary restrictions. You get into this problem about choice and what people are allowed to do and agency, and that becomes sort of a social question that is far removed somewhat from agriculture in general. Let me put this down here. Laughing Shaman continues to ask really cool questions and statements like, so then the best solution we can come to at this point is to mitigate any potential environmental destruction to the best of our ability. Is there any way to be in tune? What do you mean by in tune? In tune? What do you mean? I just mean an evolved form of what nature already does, like you just described. I guess not right now is the best answer I have for that question, because okay, I'm going to get geeky here. Hopefully you're okay with that. My favorite video game series is the Metroid series, the Metroid saga. Samus Aran, and she's a bounty hunter, space bounty hunter, but that's not important. What's important is that she was raised by this alien race of bird people called Chozo, and they were depicted as this race of beings that were technologically advanced, so technologically advanced that they screwed up their own world, foreshadowing, and then they became so technologically advanced in other worlds that they, instead of trying to dominate those worlds with tech, kind of like Coruscant in Star Wars where everything is urban, they wanted to sort of use their advanced knowledge of nature to sort of have this like you say, sort of what I assume you mean by like an in-tune, sort of like living with the trees. Instead of making a bridge, they had a tree and they made that tree into a bridge. And all this sort of low-tech and high-tech hybrid sort of way of living. And it's only possible because they had such a high degree of understanding of natural sciences and history. and things like that. Um, oh, a non-think, a non-think method, um, like a mushin, sort of like no mind, like way of going about things. Oh yeah, I'm familiar with dragonfly earth medicine. Um, so like yeah, so for example, like homesteading, right? I appreciate. Yeah, okay, good. Apparently, I'm being vindicated that I got what you were trying to talk about here. Yeah, so I think it's possible. I think it's way less possible in some environments and way more possible in other environments currently, and that may or may not change in the future depending on how things go. Um, because honestly, people were doing something sort of like that a long time ago, but they were doing that because it was a long time ago. And they didn't have the high tech to like kind of pollute necessarily. They had other ways of pollution, assuredly, but not necessarily the manners in which we do it now with like crude oil and all kinds of stuff. I don't have to like go into too much detail there. But I really do believe that an increase in technological mastery, which is sort of a vague term, but I mean like an understanding of like genetics, an understanding of machinery and physics and the natural sciences would possibly allow us to do like what the Chozo were able to do in that fictional video game, the ability to sort of become a steward. And I'm not the first person to think this. It's like there's the is it Dyson? I forget who the sci-fi author was, but they talk about like tiers of societies, and like right now we're like tier 0, tier 1, and there's like 9 tiers, and like the higher up you go on the echelon, the greater a command of basically universal physics you have. And the first level is like being able to terraform and being able to control the environment perfectly or mostly perfectly on one planet. And then having that ability allows you to basically cultivate the planet as you wish. But, they don't ever go into the details of, like, does that mean that you're conserving all the species? Are you only letting a limited number of species exist? That's sort of up in the air, not really gone into detail. Cheddar Bob 13 asks, is this an Ask Anything forum, or is there a discussion topic? And Laughing Shaman says, aside from tillage, were there any major ag practices that were negative in past ancient methods? Oh, of course, absolutely. I'll answer the first question first. You could ask other questions if you'd like. I may or may not respond, but mostly I'm talking about integrated pest management, plant cultivation, but send me a question and I'll decide if it's appropriate or not, I suppose. Frank Bird asks, what would be the most effective method in getting rid of aphids or black flies? Well, I've never heard of them called black flies, unless you mean a totally different organism. Electro-horticulture. Not familiar. Maybe I will learn something on this live stream. Tell me about electro-horticulture, Cheddar Bob. And for Laughing Shaman, an example of something that was ancient, eutrophication. People who don't know what eutrophication is, it's when the runoff of livestock or plant fertilization, all of their food, all of their manure, all of that organic material, when it rains or for whatever reason it gets transferred into lakes and rivers and streams and oceans, you have this bloom of microbial activity that sucks all of the oxygen out of the water and then kills everything that's in there. And that's usually eutrophication in a nutshell. And you better believe that was happening, back in the day, way before we had mechanization of agriculture or anything like that. Maybe not to the degree that it was, but it was definitely possible because we were growing livestock, and we didn't necessarily grow livestock always, we weren't growing them and growing them. We weren't cultivating them. We weren't raising them in like cages necessarily in the same fashion that we do now, but it's certainly a thing that happened. And of course, there was like the clearing of trees and forests and things like that. We still did that. Again, not to the level and degree that we do now, but those things also happened. And there's definitely examples, although nothing specifically comes to my mind. In China, for example, redirection of rivers, which also happened in other places, but that occurs to me because I used to live in China, and I guess that just occurred to me. So the redirection of rivers and streams and things like that, and the damming of rivers can also lead to negative effects that we didn't do like the research trialing to figure out what that would be. So there's no way that we have an idea of like how much damage that really was. You know what I mean? Chatterbob expands with using the Earth's natural electric current to stimulate plant growth. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, I'm not necessarily... well, what's your question exactly? Yeah, are you asking if it's like legitimate? I don't get it. Frank Bird asks, maybe, but have you heard of any practices of aphids prevention as well as how to get rid of it if you're infested? We've got Bemisia tabaci, which is the silverleaf whitefly, and I'm going to be talking about it. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Bemisia tabaci Q biotype. And I'm going to start with this Journal of Economic Entomology research report. The abstract says, and I'm just going to read it verbatim, that after the 2004 discovery of Bemisia tabaci, Q biotype in the United States, there was a vital need to determine the geographical and host distribution, as well as its interaction with the resident bee biotype, because of its innate ability to rapidly develop high-level insecticide resistance that persists in the absence of exposure. As part of a coordinated countrywide effort, an extensive survey of Bemisia tabaci biotypes was conducted in North America, with the cooperation of growers, industry, local, state, and federal agencies to monitor the introduction and distribution of the Q biotype. The biotype status of submitted Bemisia tabaci samples was determined either by polymerase chain reaction amplification and sequencing of a mitochondrial cytochrome oxidase 1 small subunit gene fragment and characterization of 2 biotype discriminating. I'm not going to get into all of that. Basically, they used genetic sequencing to assess whether or not the silverleaf whitefly was indeed a Q biotype or a B biotype or one of many other biotypes of Bemisia tabaci. However, interesting to note that this research report was done it was published in 2012, and I personally participated in part of the, I guess you could say, some of the sampling of Bemisia tabaci, not necessarily in this research report, but in a different one who is for somebody who is one of the authors of this research report. And it was kind of cool. So I'm in San Diego, and I'm noticing that we have Bemisia tabaci in this greenhouse. And I just happen to know that one of the people who is the author of this study they live in Florida, and they were looking for samples of Bemisia tabaci anywhere in the continental United States. I think actually Hawaii and Alaska were included as well. So, being in ornamental horticulture, I thought this would be really helpful. So I took a bunch of I said that yes, we found Bemisia. They sent over some sample vials. I put the sample vials in, or I put the Bemisia in the sample vials, and then I sent them back. And what do you know? 100% of the samples came back Q biotype positive. Oh yeah, so I didn't mention what was in the greenhouse, but these were Gerbera daisies. Crazy 24OG was asking, what were they growing? This was Gerbera daisies that they were growing, and they had Bemisia tomasi, which is a pretty common horticultural pest. It's the silverleaf whitefly, and I'm talking on this research report an effort to take the Bemisia tomasi samples and and see whether or not they were all Q biotype or which ones from which part of the United States were Q biotype. OG Kush, is that what you were saying? Cool. So yeah. So in my story, in my example, my interaction with this is small, but it gave me an understanding of just how desperate the situation was for the Q biotype sort of infestation in the United States, at least. And apparently, there's a map on this research report, and I don't know if I'll be able to show it to you adequately, but I can describe it. Here we go. Yeah. So, in California and Florida, the Q1, Q2, and Q3 biotypes were detected. But honestly, a lot of the states were, oh, you grow Gerbera daisies. Well, that's pretty cool. So this will be relevant to you then. So Canada, which they just have as a giant block here, Canada, New York, Delaware, Maine, Pennsylvania, Washington, I already mentioned California, I believe, Oregon, Nevada, or no, not Nevada, Arizona, Texas, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Yeah, those were all Q biotype areas, apparently. And so in the abstract, they mentioned something. The whole reason why people are worried about Q biotype is because Q biotype is incredibly resistant to pesticides, to insecticidal agents meant to control it. And that's a big problem in ornamental greenhouses because a lot of ornamental greenhouses are reliant on chemical agents, somewhat noxious chemical agents at that, because they are, they don't have to worry about people eating the flowers necessarily. And I'm not saying that's a good reason, not at all. But it is sort of obviously there's an economic or an ecological, cost-benefit analysis to be made for those kinds of chemical agents, particularly some of the more noxious ones like imidacloprid and abamectin, which are very well known in the cannabis space as being not something you want to mess with, for example. So, anyways, for example, at the greenhouse that I was working with, when these samples were taken out, they used biocontrol agents quite a bit. In fact, one of the greenhouse workers recently went to Carpinteria to figure out or to kind of visit with other greenhouse growers of ornamental horticulture and try to see what they're doing and sort of trade notes essentially. And what was kind of interesting was that, in fact, those other greenhouses were just starting to use biocontrols. They had been on a chemical-only or a spray-only regimen for ever, basically. And the greenhouse where this cultivator was from, they had been using biocontrols for 7 years at this point or so, more or less. But really, only within the last 4 or 5 years have they been particularly successful. And that's around the time when I was hired to work with them, because that was what I was there to do, to help them establish biocontrol agents like Amblysia swirskyii, Neostilus cucumeris. Sometimes they would use Delphastus for whitefly control, for example. All these are the first two are predatory mites that are suppressants of Bemisia tabaci. And the latter one is more effective in heavier concentrations of whitefly. And it's a ladybug, actually. It's a little small black ladybug called Delphastus catalinae. And there were other controls that were used, but like Beauveria bassiana, which was incredibly effective on whitefly. And you don't have to worry about insecticide resistance with entomopathogenic fungi, so you have that going for you. So they've been doing this for 5 years, 7 years at this point, and they were very surprised that they were the only ones. And this is very recent information for them. I still work with them. And I was kind of, it was a point of pride to me because these people were really deserving of their title. Their I don't know how to put it any other way than they were pioneers. They were pioneers in their in their discipline, and all of their other contemporaries in California, particularly in Carpinteria, were not. They were not pioneering biocontrols at all. They didn't see the need for it. They felt like it was particularly expensive, probably. But this greenhouse was able to, so that's pretty cool. But enough about them. The Bemisia tabaci is the silverleaf whitefly. It's a generalist, and it's found on a whole bunch of plants. It's found on cannabis. It's found on gerbera. Obviously, it's on roses sometimes. It's found on tobacco, I believe, and many other tomato. Most solanaceous crops, in fact. Although it's interesting to consider the different host types because Bemisia tabaci, just like a lot of pests, have preferences for different plants. And what I mean when I say preference is not like it's a cogent, cognizant preference necessarily, but more that some pests do worse on certain plants and do better on other plants. And for solanaceous plants, they often do a lot worse. And in whitefly's case, that is the case. Thrips is the same way. Western flower thrips do way better on cucumber, for example, than they do on like peppers, capsicum peppers. And there's probably a lot to do with the chemical constituencies in the leaves. People who don't know might not realize this, but like you're not supposed to eat the leaves of solanaceous crops. That means don't eat tomato leaves, don't eat pepper leaves, don't eat potato leaves. They are not great for you to eat. And yeah, so the whitefly and the western flower thrips don't do as well on those crops for that reason. And with regards to other plants that are a little bit less noxious in the leaves, they do better. Cucumber is a good example, but it varies between pests. And for gerbera, they're not really that noxious, so you can see a pretty good population of whitefly bloom and blossom if they are left to do so. That's one reason why crop scouting is so important. If you have, let's say you have 5 acres of plants in greenhouses, then you have to have somebody who can go and scout all that area. Maybe not every single plant, but they have to have some sort of a scouting regimen wherein they can assess the pest pressure. And if you don't do that, your small pest problem becomes a large pest problem, and then it costs a lot more money and yield potentially to solve it. I'm getting a question here from Sunday Trucks. Do biocontrol agents leave materials on plants while working? Poop or eggs of them? Cannabis in particular. Yeah, absolutely. And so do pests. And it's like not a problem. I know that's a contentious answer, but it isn't. And I'll tell you why. Because it's often postulated by people, maybe not super often, but I've heard a lot of people ask a similar question to you and essentially make the point that they should not use the biocontrols because they might have frass, which is the technical term for insect poop, or eggs, or exoskeletons, or something like that. which is sort of ridiculous because pests do the same thing, and nobody ever asks people to dispense of their product if they have pest exuvia or exoskeletons, or pest eggs, or pest frass. It's only if the beneficials are used, because people are thinking about the beneficial, because it's a conscious use. And they're not thinking about the pest, because most people don't understand bug physiology, which is fine. That's why people like myself and other people like ASP Insects, who just joined here. Hello, ASP. They understand the physiology and how you're basically never going to not have that. And I don't want to sound flippant or like super dismissive in an insulting way. And I know that wasn't the question that you were asking, so there's no negativity targeting you when I say this. It's just that it's sort of funny to me that people make this sort of assessment with regards to beneficials, but they never pay pests the same mind. And I think that a lot of it's because people just don't realize that they're all kind of like that. Biocontrol agents like fungi and bacteria are also going to be on your plants, and non-biocontrol agents that are fungi and bacteria are often going to be on your plants too. And in cannabis in particular, I know that there's the coliform tests and microbial tests and things like that. So there is that there is that aspect, but it is true. It's definitely true. It's a reality of cultivation and a reality of agriculture. But it's not something we should be afraid of or be worried about. I think that it's important to know, and this is important to note, and I think that not doing that is doing somebody a disservice, because they might think that they're getting this, I guess you could say, like clean room level product when they're really not. And I think it's really important to mete out that expectation. And when I say mete out, I don't mean to insult anybody by explaining it, but I mean M-E-T-E, mete it out, like with a hammer. It should be tempered. People should understand and realize that agricultural products are, a lot more dirty than perhaps people realize, and that's not a good or a bad thing, it's just a thing. But it's a good point. You're very welcome. I hope that you're thanking me for the quality of the explanation. I appreciate that you took it as a quality explanation and not me haranguing you for 3 or 4 minutes about people who are not you asking about that sort of a question and then getting upset about it. I appreciate that more than you probably appreciate me explaining. But I was talking about Bemisia tabaci, but mostly I was talking about Bemisia tabaci as a placeholder. Now that I have a grand total of 9 or 10 people uniquely watching this stream, if any of you have questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. That's kind of why I'm holding this space. But is there something cool for me to articulate about this research report? For those who are just coming in, I'm talking about a research report regarding Bemisia tabaci, and also taking questions about it and other things related to integrated pest management with regards to pests and disease and plant physiology and that sort of thing. I was actually just made aware that one of my co-workers, I suppose you could say, went up to Carpinteria to assess other greenhouses and how they function, and was very surprised to find out that only his greenhouse in California, that he went up in Carpinteria in San Diego, was using biocontrols, which is kind of cool. Plant-Based Mind says, "Where's the weed at?" Well, not here. I have the tea. Where's the tea at? The tea's right here. Tia Guanyin, my favorite. Actually, that's kind of it makes me think about the fact that me living in San Diego, there's not a whole lot of cultivation up until recently going on, which is sort of unfortunate, but I understand sort of the politics and everything that kind of goes along with that. Where's the tea at? Yeah. And it's sort of unfortunate because San Diego already is a pretty expensive place to live and a pretty expensive place to buy things in. There's a lot of taxes in California in general. And I wouldn't mind so much, not to get a little political, but I wouldn't mind so much if, like, I feel like more infrastructure, like, development and, like, remediation would be nice. I don't see it. I have no idea if it's really just not happening or if it's just too much, all the time. I'm not in a government position to find out, and I haven't done any real research on the subject. But I wouldn't mind all the taxes if, like, it felt like it actually went to what they're supposed to go and do. But that's how it is, I suppose. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, cannabis. So, like, necessarily in a place where things are really expensive and highly taxed, California and San Diego is the same way. I'm not so sure how many people who are watching are from California. If you are from California, let me know in the comments below, because I'd like to know. And know if I'm just preaching to the choir or if I'm talking about something interesting to somebody who's out of state. I had somebody on recently from Nova Scotia, which was pretty cool. And I've had people from India contact me on YouTube. Apparently my YouTube channel is sort of popular in India, which is not surprising. I mentioned that in my previous video. Biz Factories from Colorado. Callie from, alright. Yeah, there we go, Darcy Dabbs. Right, Darcy Dabbs was from Nova Scotia, so definitely represent there. So it's kind of cool to, like, have this sort of international conversation with people. So that's kind of neat. I really value that. Because at the end of the day, I'm not a very big, keep all the information here and safe and sacred and don't let anyone else find out. Like, if people are going to be successful at growing food and if we're going to have the next generation, well, here's a topic we could talk about. Bermuda. Fulfill, what is that? What is your name? Fullish Farmer. I like that name. Florida, born in San Diego, A-spin sex for sure. So cool. So quite a spread of people, but definitely people from California. Yeah, I think that's... So, like, okay. Chip the Ripper 01 says, or asks, what's the best way to get rid of fungus gnats, and how would I create an environment to keep them away? Oh, that's a good question. I just did a video on fungus gnats, on Bradisia genus fungus gnats, which are the fungus gnats that most people interact with in a cultivation setting. And you can go check out that video on my YouTube channel, Zenthanol, and that's spelled Zenthanol, Zenthanol, like Zen, like Zen Buddhism or something like that. Anyways, but I'll also answer your question here. BTI? What do you mean, BTI? Oh, I see, BTI, Bacillus thuringiensis. Okay, so there's somebody here talking about Bacillus thuringiensis. That's good. That's a good example of something that somebody could use for fungus gnat control. But keeping them out is definitely what's called a cultural control in integrated pest management. That's how you do things, basically. And what you could try to do is just like, even if you just have like a grow tent, or I don't know what scale we're talking about, so like the advice kind of changes whether or not you're growing in a tent or growing in a greenhouse or doing something like that. And honestly, it'll depend on your resources as well. In the video, I mentioned that a lot of people seem to think that diatomaceous earth is helpful for fungus gnats if you top dress it on the soil. But there's at least 2 research reports by Dr. Cloyd, who's a really respected entomologist in my opinion, and somebody I respect quite a bit, who pretty much said that diatomaceous earth does not work under laboratory conditions. So take that as a rebuke of the diatomaceous earth sort of advice that people like to give out. General Mombi says, about a decade ago, a species of South American whitefly was accidentally introduced to South Florida via a cargo ship. This whitefly seemed to specifically destroy Benjamin Bush type ficus plants. Interesting. That could be Bemisia tabaci Q type or B type or one of the. Well, there are no actually besides Q biotype and possibly a couple of others. The alphabetical list of biotypes that were associated with Bemisia tabaci are no longer considered valid, or there's great evidence to the contrary, essentially. And people have been using the word biotype a little bit incorrectly. And just so I don't lose people on what the hell biotype actually means, just think of it as I shouldn't use the word race, because race means something different also in zoology. So what I mean to say is that a biotype is like cultivar of plant, kind of just a special population that has a specific or multiple specific characteristics or traits. So do you think it was beneficial to introduce whitefly predators to combat this problem? Yeah, probably so, because whitefly can get everywhere, and especially whitefly being, I believe it's thought to be native to the tropics, or no, was it Asia? I don't want to give you guys false information, but I have a Bemisia tabaci video as well, and you can check that out, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned what it's native to, but I forget off the top of my head. But I would say that yes, it's probably very important to release predators for that in greenhouses and things like that, and also do surveys. In an ideal world, you would do survey sweeps and try to figure out the extent of the infestation in non-commercial sectors. But I don't know how many people or how well funded the resources are for that kind of a thing. Back to fungus gnats, though. So for those patiently waiting for the fungus gnat advice, diatomaceous earth isn't a good control or preventative measure. Hypoaspis or stradiolalaps are a good example of biocontrol agents for fungus gnats, although they're mostly preventative. Drenching with Beauveria bassiana is a good treatment for fungus gnats as well. But to actually keep them away, you really want to control your irrigation, which is another cultural control. Certainly you could put up physical barriers, but what you can also do is just not keep the soil so wet. And I'm being presumptuous here. I'm assuming that your soil or your substrate is probably quite moist. And I say that because that's the number one reason why people have high populations of fungus gnat larvae. And then subsequently fungus gnats. They kind of hang around in the top few inches of soil, top inch or two. So if you keep that from being super moist, you can really affect the fungus gnat population, because they don't really dig down super deep most of the time. So hopefully that was a good answer to the fungus gnat thing and the whitefly thing. And I appreciate the comment about the fungus gnat, about the whitefly. Also appreciate the fungus gnat question, but fungus or Bemisia tabaci is one of the first pest organisms I really cut my teeth on, and it was where I developed a love for Beauveria bassiana because it was so lethal and so effective. And I have multiple videos on my YouTube channel about Beauveria bassiana on whitefly. There's evidence of the hyphae gluing the body to the leaf and then killing it from the outside in and then the inside out. It's kind of a terrible way to go, but I think that's kind of cool. It's very alien. No-till is perfect for gnats to thrive, says Darcy Dabbs. No-till is perfect for... Okay, so you're saying that by not tilling, it'll help the fungus gnats grow better, you're saying? I guess because you're not destroying the first few inches of soil or feet or foot rather, depending on how you till. I guess that's kind of true. But then, that only lasts for so long. and then it might get repopulated, right? So you're probably not going to be tilling while the crop is still like living in the soil, right? So I don't know if that's necessarily true long term, but you could certainly kill an overwintering population potentially. But most people aren't dealing with that necessarily. But every cultivation space is a little bit different. Biz Factory says, not with stradiomites and BTI, I never see them 12 cycles in. Do you mean that they're not like good? Well, you should. Oh, that's actually a good point. By 12 cycles, do you mean like 12 harvests, or what exactly do you mean by cycles? But if you mean what I think you mean, then yeah, you have to reapply them a lot of the time. A lot of biocontrols should be reapplied. Like Bacillus thuringiensis is not going to be necessarily active at the same levels that you need it to be after one inoculation. Beauveria bassiana is the same way. Okay, so 12 harvests. So yeah, like 12 harvests in. That's depending on what plants we're talking about, that's quite a long time. That can be 12 years, or it could be 6 years, or it could be 4 years, or something like that. So definitely a good point there. Reinoculation and reinoculation or inundative releases that are at a set period of time is really important for biocontrols. Or what you can do is you can establish the population. Depending on the organism you're working with, you might be able to provide for the organism in a way such that the organism can live and subsist. And one of the ways you can do that is with pollen for certain predatory mites, like Swirsky, for example.
Highest mean of Swirsky per leaf was Capsicum annum explosive ember at about 1200 Swirsky. It also had significantly more eggs and motile life stages per individual. All three cultivars, however, were successful in prophylactic capability. Aside from the source of food, small shelters made from non-glandular trichomes called tuft domatia have been implicated by other researchers as helpful for predatory mites, and these were observed on the pepper plants. Tuft domatia may have the following benefits: shelter for breeding and development, increasing the fungal spores which might serve as alternative food sources for some, moderating the microenvironment, especially humidity, and affording protection from intra-guild predation.
They eat pollen. In fact, they reproduce very well on pollen. Hypoaspis and stradio are also possible to establish, since you're asking, but they typically eat things like fungus gnat larvae. They eat mold mites, for example. If you have a really organically rich sort of substrate, then you very well could have that work out for your benefit. If you have springtails, they'll feed on those too. But like again, you would have to have, it's carrying capacity. It's how many food organisms you have, and how many predator organisms you have, and how many food organisms do you need for how many predators over X amount of time. It actually gets to pretty large numbers when you really think about it. And since these organisms aren't necessarily omnivorous, you have to make sure that they're well supplied with food. And that's kind of the point that was being made earlier about reinoculation and having, like, not seeing them 12 cycles in. You must inoculate and you must inundate, which is another reason why biocontrol agents are so expensive, because people have to commit to a plan, and they have to commit to that plan with high regularity. And if they don't, then the efficacy of that plan is severely hampered, which a lot of people don't like. It's sort of inconvenient. And for people who just care about, the bottom line, it's much easier for them to just hire a sprayer and, well, not hire, but have one, and then apply the compound of choice one time for a certain amount of time. And even with non-systemic pesticides and chemical agents, you still have to reapply and respray those too. So honestly, you're still got a problem there. I guess I look a little bit better when the computer light is off, now that I think about it. I'm kind of washed out here, but that's okay. Darcy Dab says that they have a lot of springtails. Well, excellent. Then you probably have a pretty good population, or you may have a population already of Hypoaspis miles or Stradiolaelaps. Yeah, so. Got a leaf in there. Yeah, so biocontrol. There's actually I'll springboard off of that point. So there's two main ways to apply biocontrol agents. The first way is known as an inundative release, which is what I was saying previously. The second way is inoculatively, which is the establishing that I was talking about. So in an inundative strategy, you're basically worried about taking a massive population and spreading it out in the crop, and just using sheer numbers to make the overall control more efficacious or more rapid, possibly. Because sure, you might be able to use like X amount of predator organism per square meter, or you can use 3 times X per predator, or X predator per square meter, and maybe be done with 1/3 of the time. It's just simple math and logistics there, but it's also going to be maybe 3 times as expensive. So it depends on what you're doing, and depends on what makes the most sense to do. With regards to the inoculative release, you're more preventatively, although not always, but you're preventatively establishing the population before the pest organism is there, or you're doing it even though the pest is there in low numbers, so that the population can mass sort of organically. And the benefit to that is that it might be a lot less costly, and you might be able to see results without having to spend so much money and time and labor and effort that way. But not all predators work best in the inoculative fashion. Some of them, they just will starve to death if their food isn't there, so you have to take that into consideration if that's worth it to just continuously apply these organisms week after week after week. Especially if the pest is not ever present throughout the year. That can be sort of a lot of money. Asp Insect says that they have springtails for potential bug food. Yeah, that's right. Actually, I have a question, Asp. Do you, I forget, you do keep insects, right? I'm pretty sure. Feel like I shouldn't be asking that question, but I want to just make sure that that's true and I'm not thinking about somebody else. There's a bunch of people I follow on Instagram who keep insects, either regularly as like pets or to sell, or irregularly, kind of like whimsically, like I do typically. But yeah, you do. So I'm curious, do you have to deal a lot with like phoretic mites, or like mites that will like maybe not be parasitic, or not even like mutualistic, but just kind of like associated mites in your terraria? Because I feel like you would have to deal with that, or that we've even talked about that subject matter, or maybe it was somebody else. I'm not sure. Because that's sort of a thing that I've always thought would be kind of like helpful, is to use Hypoaspis or Stradiolaelaps in like the I guess you could say like the pet bug realm, or like the exotic insects realm, where in which you get mites and that sort of thing. Mites with superworms. Yes, we have talked about that. Right. Yeah, so okay, so that's why I'm having all these thoughts come to my mind. It's because we've already spoken about it. Good. Yeah, because I mean it's not super popular, it's more popular in different parts of the world and that sort of a thing. But like, yeah, I know Bugs in Cyberspace often has or not often, but I believe that there are some mites associated with some of those organisms that he keeps, and I think that having predator mites and using them in terraria might be really helpful for enthusiasts, I suppose. General Mombi says, every few months I find a mealybug in my mother room. They never take hold, and make it an issue. But what's the lowdown on these cottony pests? Well, if you have cottony cushion scale, which is technically not a scale insect, it's not a mealybug anyways. That's a little bit different. But if you mean the waxy cottony mealybugs like citrus mealybug and that sort of a thing, I'd be happy to talk about it. You're gonna have to tell me when to shut up. Mealybugs are they are kind of like aphids and whiteflies in that they have a little sucker. No, not a sucker. They have a stylet, and they puncture the plant. They suck out phloem or plant sap. Small populations are not super problematic, like you're noting. However, there are some species that are able to transfer disease and transmit disease. So that's something to consider, but like in cannabis and perhaps other situations, it's not necessarily a big problem. But scale insects in general, specifically mealybugs in general, are their wax is hydrophobic. So that's helpful for rain, but it's also helpful for pesticides. If you're spraying a pesticide without a surfactant for mealybugs, it might just run off their waxy coat. And so using a surfactant kind of atomizes the compound and might allow ingress a little bit easier. They don't move a whole lot, as you're probably aware. Males are very uncommon, very rare, and females typically reproduce parthenogenetically, so they're just making a bunch of eggs. So it's really good to nip them in the bud. I'm glad that you haven't seen them as a big problem, but you should kill them immediately. Not that I'm assuming that you don't already do that, but for people who don't know and have never had mealybugs before, you can check out my videos on both root mealybugs and citrus scale. And I think those are the only two mealybug videos I've done so far. But yeah, they can be difficult to deal with, especially if the population is allowed to bloom out of control, because sometimes they can make up to 100 or 150 or sometimes 300 eggs per individual. And if you even assume like, I don't know, if you assume a mortality rate of 50%, that's still a ton of babies, which are probably going to be females, and they're probably going to produce another generation very quickly. So definitely a good point. Asp says, Tyrophagus or something similar. Not sure how I can identify them, but they like to feed on the grain. Oh yeah, right. So you're getting mold mites, which Hypoaspis and Stratiolaelaps definitely go after. So good point on that. I'm glad that you don't have them anymore. Sometimes those things sort of work themselves out. I often feel like an ample or a surplus of food usually encourages the population to grow rapidly, and the reduction of that food can help, or sort of a maturation of the colony can also help diminish their population. Over vacation, the terraria seem to have dried out for a while. Oh yeah, so that can be helpful too. Definitely, sometimes things just kind of work out that way, which is another like unsatisfactory answer, because if somebody asks me, well, what happened in like a pest cultivation or a plant cultivation situation with pests, it's like sometimes I don't know what the answer is, and there's not enough data to figure it out, and it's kind of like trying to figure out like a murder mystery. It's like who done it? Who knows? Oftentimes it's a combination of many factors and not just one reason, just like in real life for other things. So, yeah. So, as for the puffy cottony cocoon, you should definitely send me a picture if you have one, if you can get one. Definitely send me one, because that's an important, a small but important distinction to make, because cottony cushion scale, if it is one, then like the part of the half of the body that looks like the body is actually just a giant egg sac, and those things are prolific. Those things are even more prolific than a lot of mealybugs, just to be honest with you. So definitely nip them in the bud and kill them on sight if you can. Let's see here. Daga Derek says, thoughts on springtails hanging out under my rockwool cubes? No problem. Don't worry about them. No biggie. not a detriment, not a threat. Predator mite food, as I was talking about before. Good question though. People often ask me if they're dealing with root aphids or if they're dealing with like mold mites or something like that when they ask me, oh, what is this? And it's a springtail and it's harmless. So definitely want to assuage you of any sort of concerns with that. And I'm getting a question here. Yeah, the superworms are more resistant to destruction or desiccation than the mites, so it looks like that worked out. Yeah, that's very possible, certainly. The mold mites definitely like their humidity, that's for sure. But good questions all around. Definitely appreciate the input, for sure. One thing that I wish that I had for this live feed was like a timer, because I know I'm only allowed to have it for an hour, and I didn't time myself, so I have no idea how much time I have left. But appreciate the input, appreciate the good questions, and I'm glad that other people are getting use out of that too. That's why I do this. You're very welcome, by the way, Daga Derek. If anyone else has any other questions or topics of conversation, ASP, you always have good questions. I really appreciate you bringing up the super depressing but realistic situation that befalls our insect kin, because if they go, we are in a lot of trouble on the higher trophic level. So hopefully we can turn that around for everyone. Darcy Dabs, yeah, the springtail's excrement is going to be like mini fertilizer, and they're going to sort of bioturbate, which if you don't know what bioturbation is, it's just the movement of nutrients by microbes and other microarthropods and small insects in like ecology. So like earthworms will eat things and they'll poop, right? And so they'll leave nutrients essentially throughout the soil as they move. Springtails do the same thing, mites do the same thing, and so all those tetraphores are like that. Possible biocontrol use in Dolichopodidae. Aren't those the okay, hold on, you're predatory long-legged the long-legged flies, right? Yeah, I don't think that they're bred for it necessarily, but I definitely recognize that they are helpful for that. I think there's also the hunter fly, which I think is Cotesia. I think is the genus, or Coanosia? Yeah. Anyways, yeah, I don't think that they're bred specifically for biocontrol. However, I do recognize that they are quite good at what they do, which is predating on smaller little soft-bodied organisms, I think, like aphids and that sort of a thing. Yeah, General Mombi, I appreciate you too. I'm glad that you appreciate the help. I'm glad to help you out. Chip the Ripper 01 says, love what you do, man. Well, I appreciate the comment. Appreciate the compliment. Yeah, check out the YouTube channel. I don't say that to shamelessly plug. I say it because, for one, that's the reason why I make the videos. I make them so that they're a reference for other people in video form, taking a whole bunch of academic literature, condensing it down to the parts that are helpful for cultivators, and then shipping it out for people in 1 to 2, maybe 3-minute videos that are really easy to digest. I'm surprised that other people haven't done that. I mean, I guess other people have done something sort of similar, but usually they're salespeople who are trying to sell you a product. And I'm not trying to sell you a product, I'm just trying to give you information that is paywall blocked, and you have to pay hundreds of dollars to access the research reports, which is crazy, and in my opinion, very myopic. So, yeah, for those who are interested in that information, which I'm always constantly making more of, and this video right here is going to be on that channel as well, just like my other live videos that you can check. So if you had a question and you don't remember what I said and the live feed is ended after 24 hours, you can go back to my YouTube channel and see what I'm talking about and what you were talking about. Coanosia. Right, okay, cool. So thanks for fact-checking me on that for the hunter fly. Yeah, so you bring up a good point. Not only do they go after small flies, I'm going to leave my computer off at this point with the monitor, I think. But yeah, they'll also go after parasitic wasps, so it's kind of like, again, it's sort of neutral in that way. Go after beneficials, but also go after detrimentals, and that's life. Life doesn't play by our good versus evil battle for cultivation of plants. They're just worried about their next meal, which makes sense. Yeah, I'm also surprised. I bet that a lot of the reason why we don't see long-legged flies in use for biocontrol has a lot to do with the fact that there's probably a huge association with like ewe flies. And I don't mean just like because we have the hunter fly, but I don't think those are bred either. But we also have the spider mite fly, but I feel like it's not very popular, honestly. So I think that there's the ick factor of flies, but there also might be some like physiological issue with the like development of them as a biocontrol agent. But I'm just shooting in the dark. I don't really know. Um, it could be as simple as nobody has just researched them very much. Maybe we'll see something in the future, though. I'd like that. It'd be nice if we had a larger ratio of entomologists and horticulturalists looking at that sort of a thing. So, yeah, good questions, good points. Glad that people are taking interest in the content. I've gotten a lot of positive, on that note, I've gotten a lot of positive input from people. I've had people contribute to my Patreon, which if you don't know, I have a Patreon for the research that I put out. I'm trying to sort of essentially justify and subsidize the free time efforts that I put out for the information. I believe that, the content's always going to happen. The content is always going to be free. I'm not going to be stingy with the information. People ask me all the time questions, and I would like to say that I have pretty much a 100% answer rate for questions and comments and that kind of a thing. Because at the end of the day, if it helps one person save some money or not poison themselves or something like that, then it's really worth it to me as a sort of a social cost that has been mitigated through that. So I really appreciate the positive input from people. I appreciate the positive support, small monetary support or just positive feelings or sharing the content that I do. It does really help out. And it's helped out a lot of other people learning more information. So it's just sort of this multiplicative sort of effect. So I really appreciate other people taking the time to appreciate me, appreciating you, and that sort of a thing. I think I'll make that. I'll kind of leave it there, I suppose. They say that in victory, learn when to stop, and not as if this is victory, but this is probably me talking a little bit too much about other people appreciating. So, for those who are just joining us, we were talking about integrated pest management techniques with regards to fungus gnats and whether springtails are okay or not. We talked about predatory mites. We talked about particularly soil predatory mites, for example. We've also been talking about the silverleaf whitefly Bemisia tabaci. So, a big topic of conversation. If you want to find out about that and you're just joining in now, my YouTube channel is online, it's Zenthanol, and this video is going to be on it. So if you want your question answered and you want it to be on YouTube, and you want that question to be there for other people to know what you've asked and for you to have a response that you can come back to, please ask me, and I will be happy to help you out. Hopefully I'll be able to help you out. Not always do I have an answer for everything, but I've done pretty good. I feel like. And I appreciate the love, Lovelock War and General Mombi. Definitely appreciate all of you guys. But what's another good topic for IPM that I could talk about? Does anyone have a question? Something to go over? Or something that they're not sure about? We've also talked about Bacillus thuringiensis and Beauveria bassiana as biocontrol agents and the different techniques of releasing biocontrol agents and the strategy that goes along with it. which is really important. A lot of people just buy the biocontrols, assume that they will work. One thing I'm often surprised about is people asking me, well, I bought these ladybugs, are they going to eat my spider mites or whatever? And while there is a spider mite eating ladybug, it is not the 7-spotted ladybug that a lot of people buy. It's not the Asian import ladybug that people buy necessarily. You should know what your biocontrols go after if you buy them, because otherwise you'll have buyer's remorse. And I wouldn't want people to assume that biocontrols don't work because they didn't buy the right ones or didn't know what they were doing. One of the most unfortunate things about biocontrols in general, in my opinion anyways, is that a lot of people's first sort of interaction with biocontrols is with a salesperson. And just because you're a salesperson doesn't mean that you're a bad person by any stretch of the imagination at all. But it does introduce a sort of a bias that I'd like to evaporate out of the discussion. Because in my experience, people who have to toe the line and have to sell products sometimes don't like that other products are more successful, or they can't talk about other products because they're competition, and that's sort of unfortunate. A lot of other people in biocontrol are, super transparent, and they're very helpful, and they know each other, and that's the kind of thing I'd like to establish with people. So I really appreciate that that there is also that contingent as well. But for people, a lot of the times they're not aware of what biocontrols do, and they just trust what somebody says at face value because they don't have any of this physiological information. They haven't read a research report about how plants and insects interact or any of that sort of stuff. So again, another reason why I make the content that I do, because I'm not selling anything. It's all not even just my opinion, it's all academic literature for the most part backing up what I'm saying. And that's, I think, very important as well. Lovelock War says biology in the soil is key, finding the key. Definitely an important facet of both biocontrol and just the cultivation of plants in general. You also go on to say, I found that if my biological life in my soil then I'm just going to be running in. So if it's not very good, you're just going to be running in circles. I think there's some truth to that for sure, but it's a little bit of a vague statement as to what you mean by biology, because that's literally everything besides the abiotic stuff, right? But definitely having a good balance of organisms if you're trying to grow organically in like soil substrate, for example, definitely helpful. All right, we're getting some paragraphs here. Top Grade Medical says, slow release packets of Swirsky. Are there actually 2 spots implemented to... Hold on, I can't. There's some typos here. Are there actual 2-spotted implementations to feed Amblysseus in packet? Seems like I get mites where I don't have them when I have used slow-release packets. Well, you might get mold mites from sachets for Swirsky, because some Swirsky sachets, like from Coppert Biologicals, for example, they have biocontrol. They have feeder mites in the sachets. They're supposed to help the population increase quite a bit before they egress out of the sachet and ingress into the crop. And this is supposed to happen over time, multiple weeks rather. And there's a special ratio of predators to feeder mites for that particular reason. As for 2-spot spider mites, there's no reason why they should be in the sachets. After all, not only do the Swirsky and cucumbers, for example, don't really go after them so much, they also have to feed on plants. So since they're often not raised on plants, it doesn't really make sense that you'd have 2-spotted. So that's probably 2-spotted spider mites coming in from somewhere else, and those things aren't really related exactly. But it's good that you're making those observations. I hope that you're recording that information. so that you can make those sorts of associations, because pattern recognition is very important when it comes to assessing whether a treatment was good or bad. Good is not a number, right? You can't just say, oh, I think it did well. Well, what does that really mean? Like, when you get down to the, like, finite details, how many hot spots were really treated? Is the population really gone, or is it just in remission and there's a lower population than you're used to seeing? You can't tell if you don't record that. So it's really important to take detailed notes, especially in a commercial setting. General Mombi says, 2 months ago, I began running a hydro shop and am alarmed by the IPM of the majority of customers using Avid, Eagle 20, and Compass. I'm trying to steer them in a better direction, but they're lazy. Yeah, a lot of people are lazy. Oftentimes we like to blame the pesticide manufacturers, but the people who are using the pesticides incorrectly are oftentimes the people, in my opinion, who are truly at fault. Because they're the ones knowingly buying the compound that they shouldn't be buying, or they're buying the compound and they're allowed to use it, but they're using it irresponsibly. That's a good point. Interesting study about detritus, dead insects in mosquito larvae habitat soil affects interspecific competition. That's kind of cool. I'd like to, if you have that report, please send it to me. General Mombi says again, and just want to spray. They just want to spray a few times. What can I recommend to them to use that'll work swiftly? That's a safe alternative. They're lazy, to be quite honest. Predatory bugs and continuous IPM is a total turn-off to them. And I only have 30 seconds remaining, so I'm going to be very quick about that. You're probably not going to be able to get anything that is nearly as quick as any of those compounds are. So if they're truly lazy and they really don't care, if they're ambivalent or if they're lazy, if they're ambivalent, they're probably not going to worry about it. And I'm going to leave it there. Find us on YouTube.